right, everybody, we're going to get started in the interest of time. So it's my honor to introduce Professor Bagley, prior to joining the law school faculty at the University of Michigan, he was an attorney with the appellate staff in the civil division at the U.S. Department of Justice, where he argued a dozen cases before the U.S. Court of Appeals, and acted as lead counsel in the bar. Professor Bagley has served as a law clerk to Justice John Paul Stevens of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Honorable David S. Cadle of the U.S. Court of Appeals, District of Columbia Circuit. Professor Bagley holds a BA in English from Yale University and received his JD summa cum laude from New York University School of Law. Before entering law school, he joined Teach for America and taught 8th grade English at a public school in South Bronx. His work has appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the Columbia Law Review, the Georgetown Law Journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, and Politics, Policy, and Law. In 2012, he was a recipient of the law school's Hart Wright Award for Excellence in Teaching, and is a frequent contributor to The Incidental Economist, a prominent health policy law. So with that, please welcome Professor Bagley.
So I gather I'm supposed to stand sort of somewhere near this so that we can be heard over whatever stream that we're having. I'm going to talk today about ongoing legal challenges with the ACA. I want this to be as informal as possible, so please interrupt me. I'm happy to ride along about this for as long or as short as you want me to, but I want to make sure, too, that I don't slip accidentally into law talk where I'm talking past you, so I'll try to make sure that I don't use any of the weird jargon and communicate this in plain English. So the Affordable Care Act has been the subject of legal challenges from literally the moment it was adopted. Challenged within 5 minutes of its actual, that President Obama signed it, and we've had round after round after round of lawsuits being brought against it. The first wave of lawsuits brought against the Affordable Care Act had to do with the constitutionality of the individual mandate. We'll get back to that. The second wave of challenges had more to do with implementation, questions about whether the Obama administration colored kind of in the lines when it came to rolling out the ACA. The third round of Affordable Care Act challenges, I think, can be grouped under what you may think of as Trump administration sabotage, sort of a continuing backlash to the law, notwithstanding that it's been in place now for nearly a decade. There are two big lawsuits that I'm going to talk about today. I'm happy to talk about anything else that might be on your minds when it comes to legal challenges involving the ACA or healthcare generally, but I'll focus on these two lawsuits for purposes of my comments. The first has to do with work requirements. So our former Governor Rick Snyder, on his way out, signed a law given to him by the state legislature saying that the state had to apply for a waiver from the Department of Health and Human Services to impose work requirements on people here in the state of Michigan in order for them to maintain their eligibility for Medicaid. The new work requirements rules would apply only to adults, non-elderly, not disabled. They would have to report that they worked 80 hours a month or lose their health coverage. Work requirements hold really well. They sound really good. Right? If you are going to take benefits of health care free, maybe you should give something back. Maybe you should at least not be sitting on your right? There's kind of commonsensical feel. As a policy matter, they are a total disaster. Most people who receive Medicaid, about 60%, are already. Of the rest, people who are not working, they are a mix of taking care of family members, disabled, in school. There is a tiny category of people who are not working, what you might think of as applied children. Some of them can't find jobs, some of them are struggling with other different challenges in their lives. Perhaps on the margin, you could encourage them to work. Maybe even so, there's not much juice in that sense. There aren't that many people that work requirements are going to actually get a job who don't have one already. I mean, the fact is, right? Most Medicaid beneficiaries want to work. They don't want to be stuck at their home. And if they can, they will find a job. They will certainly try to. Most of them. The other part of work requirements that doesn't get quite as much attention is that they actually end up having a much harsher effect than you might imagine given the number of people who work. You might think, well, work requirements aren't that big of a deal since most people work. or they're going to find some way to say that they're eligible for an exemption. Well, it turns out that just navigating the system to report your hours is an enormous barrier for most Medicaid beneficiaries. And I think at times it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this, right? But like, just think to yourself, like have I ever like returned a library book late? I certainly have, and like the fines kind of rack up, and even sometimes they're kind of embarrassing, right? Like $22 for a book that you didn't turn in for 6 months. Well, imagine if, in consequence of not returning your library book, you lost your Medicaid coverage, right? That's actually what most Medicaid beneficiaries here are going to be. And remember, this is a population that's struggling to make ends meet, that's struggling to kind of keep their lives together. If you're on Medicaid, things are not going great for you, right? You are on financial thin ice already. You are already stressed out about trying to pay your bills, trying to figure out how to make all this stuff work. And then we tell you, hey, report your hours to Medicaid every month on pain of losing your Medicaid. And a lot of them just can't manage it, right? Or don't manage it. And so these bars here are an estimate, extrapolated from experience we have in Arkansas, of the number of people who are going to lose coverage. And they kind of ran a couple of different scenarios. But the orange percentages here are the folk who lose coverage even though they are actually eligible for an exemption or working the requisite number of hours. Meaning that the number of people who lose coverage because they are failing to meet the obligations of the work requirement program are trivial, somewhere on the order of between 10 and maybe 40% at most. But the vast majority of people who are going to lose coverage as a result of work requirements are either eligible for exemptions or already working. Which may lead you to wonder, what is the point of these work requirements? You're not going to get people to work, and you're going to see a lot of people who ought to be eligible for Medicaid kicked off the rolls. You can be forgiven for wondering whether the point of work requirements is not to get people to work, but to kick people off of Medicaid who the Republican legislature think don't really deserve it in the first place. Work requirements are a way of pushing back against the Affordable Care Act's expansion of Medicaid to what the right will call able-bodied adults. Previously, traditional Medicaid was available to people who were parts of the categorically needy, right? The deserving poor. If you were elderly or disabled or a child, later pregnant women, right? You could get health care. You were entitled if you were poor enough. But if you were a single adult without kids, no matter how poor you were, you couldn't get access to Medicaid. The Affordable Care Act changed that and just said, look, if you're below 133% of poverty, you get Medicaid. And this is part of an effort to undo that transformation of the Medicaid program. Right? The Affordable Care Act said Medicaid is not going to be a welfare program anymore. It's going to be a basic part of our social insurance scheme. And this is part of an effort to push back on that. So work requirements have been requested now by 20 states. They've gone into effect in about 6, including here in the state of Michigan. They took effect on January 1st. In the meantime, lawsuits have been filed. The first lawsuit was, the first question is, are work requirements legal? So this is a question I knew was going to come up, so I wrote this a couple of years ago. We'll get back to what I said in that in a moment. The lawsuits hinge on this section of the Medicaid statute. I won't make you read that. It actually is pretty simple. What it says is that the Secretary of Health and Human Services has the authority to grant waivers from most of Medicaid's rules, not all of them, but most of them, when those waivers are for a genuine experiment, a demonstration project, some effort to find out whether an intervention might work for a population we don't know for sure, that promotes Medicaid's objectives. Okay, so those are the 2 things that a Medicaid waiver has to do. The challengers in the lawsuits, and these initial lawsuits were brought against waivers in Arkansas, Kentucky, and New Hampshire. The challengers said, look, these work requirement waivers have problems on both accounts. First of all, they're not genuine experiments. Nobody's really thinking that what HHS wants to do is test this. I mean, sure, HHS, when it granted the waiver, said that it was interested in learning more about how work requirements affect these populations, and maybe it'll improve the health of populations because work can improve health. We don't know, so let's test it. The plaintiff said that's pretty transparently not what's going on here. You're trying through subterfuge to change the program. Their better argument, though, had to do with the promotion of Medicaid's objectives. So if you actually, look at estimates of what the effective work requirements are going to be, best estimates are that tens of thousands of people in each state, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose coverage. We've now got good evidence out of Arkansas, which is the only program that went into effect and actually dropped people from the rolls, that that's exactly what happens. Tens of thousands of people lose health insurance coverage as a result of work requirements. And so the challengers made the very common sense claim, look, how can a waiver promote Medicaid's objectives if the result of that waiver is to kick a bunch of people off of Medicaid? How does that make any sense? The administration's response, Trump administration's response, is these waivers, we think that the purpose of Medicaid isn't just about giving people Medicaid. We think it's about making people healthier. And we think that work can make people healthier. There's observational data linking work and health. And who knows which way that causal arrow runs. You might think that if you're healthy, you're more able to work. But they say maybe if you work, that makes you healthier. So maybe giving people a swift kick in the butt to get them to work will actually make them healthier. We don't know. We're going to test it. The district court judge who heard this case, an Obama appointee, Judge Boesberg, was having none of it. In all three cases, Judge Boesberg wrote very strong opinions saying the waivers were arbitrary and capricious. And the reason he said they were arbitrary and capricious and therefore invalid was that HHS didn't ever actually explain how, in Kentucky, for example, 97,000 people were estimated to lose coverage. They never explained how 97,000 people losing healthcare coverage could plausibly improve the health of the Medicaid population as a whole. HHS sort of danced over that, didn't discuss it enough, didn't pay enough attention to it. Judge Boesberg thought that was unreasonable, that if they were going to adopt a waiver like this, it was incumbent on the agency to think harder about the effects that this would have on the people who lost healthcare coverage. So he wasn't buying it. After a round of kind of revision at the agency went back, tried again. Judge Boesberg again was having nothing to do with this. And so then the Trump administration has taken an appeal. The case was appealed to the DC Circuit, right? And the DC Circuit heard argument, I think back in November or December, and that argument went really badly for the Trump administration. That panel included one Obama appointee and one Carter appointee, right? So somebody was appointed quite some time ago, neither of whom were happy. And even the Reagan appointee on the panel was quite skeptical of the Trump administration's claims. So we have every reason to think that the DC Circuit is going to release an opinion that is broadly aligned with the decision that Judge Boesberg. When they're going to do so is very much an open question. There was a hope that maybe the DC Circuit would get its act together to get us an opinion before the beginning of the new year, when work requirements here in Michigan took effect. No such luck. A lawsuit has been filed challenging the Michigan waiver, but until the DC Circuit rules, it's kind of going kind of slow. As soon as the DC Circuit renders its decision, that lawsuit will become sort of hot again. And Judge Boesberg, before whom the Michigan case is also pending, is likely to invalidate the waiver granting Michigan's work requirements waiver, at which point the state would be precluded from kicking people off the Medicaid rolls. In the meantime, of course, Medicaid beneficiaries have been getting notices saying work requirements are going to apply to you, you've got to work, you've got to start reporting your hours. People are already starting to report their hours. There's going to be a ton of confusion, more confusion than there is already, in a population that's already confused about healthcare because, oh my God, it's confusing. This is not a good outcome. The next question is, well, what happens after the DC Circuit rules? Because, of course, that's not the end of the road. The next step is the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court is now a conservative majority, very solid conservative majority court. So how are these work requirements going to fare in front of the Supreme Court? On that front, I can only offer you my sort of best gut sense, which brings me back to this piece that I wrote. When courts review agency decisions, generally what they try to do is defer to the agency. Try to say, look, we're going to cut you some slack, but we don't know Medicaid, we don't know health. Like, you guys are the experts. Our review here should be ginger and deferential. And HHS, when it granted these waivers, it went through and explained why they were experiments and why they promoted Medicaid's objectives. Judge Boesberg said, you know what, Medicaid's objectives can't include this reference to health, right? It can't be that Medicaid's about promoting health. It's about something else. And for support, he pointed to a provision of an appropriations bill, of the Medicaid law that talks about appropriations. I won't make you read all that, but I guess I will. It says to furnish medical assistance on behalf of families with dependent children and of aged, blind, or disabled individuals. This is what the purpose of Medicaid is, he says. For the purpose of enabling each state, as far as practicable, to furnish medical assistance. He says that's the purpose of Medicaid. You can't just talk about some general health-related purpose. And I don't know that the Supreme Court is going to buy that argument. This is not an affirmative declaration from Congress about the only purpose that Medicaid is supposed to serve. Usually agencies get some deference on defining the goals of the programs that they manage. So when HHS says the goal of Medicaid is to promote health, and if that sounds, both intuitively plausible and broadly aligned with the program's purposes, the courts are quite likely in most cases to defer. And that's where the fact that it's a conservative majority court comes back in. Remember that the question for Judge Boesberg is, did it behave unreasonably when it ignored the possibility that tens of thousands of people might lose their health care coverage? He said, yes. And I think if you're a Democrat, that kind of sounds right? I mean, if you think like work requirements, you kind of believe right out of the gate that they are a cloak for just kicking people off the program. It's intuitively, this just sounds correct. Yeah, of course this is arbitrary. This is a bad policy. It can't possibly serve Medicaid's purposes because people are going to lose Medicaid. But if you have a different political orientation and you are open to the possibility that work requirements are a good thing for programs like this, I think you might be inclined to think that the agency acted, reasonably, giving it quite a bit of deference. It isn't a criticism of sort of one political party or another. It's a point about how we think about reasonableness. That's something that the administration, that the Obama administration does is going to seem genuinely more reasonable to a Democrat than it will to a Republican, and vice versa. And so if you've got Republican-appointed judges at the Supreme Court who are looking at this, who are open to the possibility that these work requirements are a good thing, who don't know health, who want to make a statement about how we gotta, stop it with the resistance judging in the courts, I think these work requirements are likely to be sustained in the Supreme Court. I think it's likely to be 5-4. It won't happen probably for another year or so. And if a Democrat's elected in the meantime, all of these work requirement waivers are going to be gone. So I think the stakes here for work requirements in Michigan and elsewhere really turn on the election. So much does. At least that's my best sense. Yeah, did you have a question back there?
Part of the interpretation of the second half of that clause, so furnish medical assistance on behalf of families with dependent children. So the work requirements are targeted to not those.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with linking it, hitching your horse to this, is that it does seem like this is a part of the Medicaid law that doesn't actually align with the work requirements, right? So like you're plucking from a provision, and actually the function of this section isn't actually to announce in any kind of broad sense Medicaid's purposes. The function of this section is actually just to allow, it's a technical internal function for Congress. It's meant to instruct the Appropriations Committee that it has the authority to appropriate the money. The rest of the House and Senate have said, yes, you have the authority to appropriate the money for this program. But that's all it is. It's not an identification of purposes that the courts are going to say, yes, that's the only purpose.
Very interesting, because in South Carolina, the state that tried to attack work requirements to the population.
I can't recall. I don't think any waivers have gotten granted for that yet, although I could be wrong. But there are certainly states that are interested in doing that.
But everybody else so far is ending.
Focusing on the expansion population. Yeah, and in fact, I think most of the nasty things that you might think that the Trump administration is doing to Medicaid are focused on that expansion population. So the last week's announcement of block grants, for example, or the waivers that would enable something like block grants, are focusing almost exclusively on the expansion population. Again, because I think this is part of the campaign to change what the ACA did to Medicaid, right? We don't want it to be a program that's like social insurance, that's socialized medicine. We want it to be a welfare program, stigmatized for the poor, that, like it was before.
When laws are written, if they are more specific, then the Supreme Court has presumably an easier job in determining and interpreting, because there's less left to question.
Yeah.
But it seems paradoxical that when legislation is written, it's purposely written in some vagueness, like medical necessity. There's nothing. There's no definition of medical necessity in the ACA. I don't think there is. Why is that? And we have a system that is so polarized, and there is a way out, but we shouldn't be looking to the Supreme Court. We should be looking to the public, to legislation, and just make it clear, what do we want as a society?
I couldn't agree more. I do. I wish, one of the things that strikes me after doing this work, right, like it's a decade on, I shouldn't be having a talk here about ongoing legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act. These are ridiculous. Right? And how we're going to run ourselves as a country if we're going to filter everything through the courts, if everything is going to be a hard, we've got to make collective decisions. Sometimes people are going to be unhappy about those decisions. Sometimes we just got to say, you know what, the decision's been made and we're moving on. So I would prefer that I wasn't here. I would prefer that the courts were much less involved in our policymaking. I would prefer that we didn't vest such authority in counter-majoritarian institutions like the Supreme Court, like the Senate, right? That we actually focused on trying to get the people's voices filtered through the system without getting bollocks out. It's hard. On vagueness, look, the reason that I think this case is a difficult case for the plaintiffs here, right, even though work requirements are a policy disaster, is precisely because of the vagueness that you talked about. So the waiver statute actually predates Medicaid. It was connected originally to AFDC, to cash welfare. You could do small experiments. That was the legislative history. Congress talked about tiny little, experiments, maybe in a couple of cities here and there. Sure, you can do a little bit of experimentation with welfare. But this language is on the books, and it's taken on a life of its own. And now the Medicaid program is to a large degree run through gigantic statewide waivers that really don't plausibly serve much experimental purpose anymore, but are vehicles for transforming the program. And you might think that's a terrible abdication of legislative responsibility, and I think there's something to that. But it's also a response to the sclerosis of our system. So if we have a desire to do stuff, whatever that stuff might be, and Congress is so, fractious and unable to actually do anything, there's going to be pressure on the part of sitting administrations to take advantage of whatever kind of executive power they can. And that means they're going to push up against the boundaries of what the law allows them to do. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing pushing up against these boundaries time and time again.
But if one of these requirements is the experimental piece of it, and if the experiment in Arkansas showed the results were opposite of improvement.
Well, what Arkansas showed was that tens of thousands of people lost coverage, but it doesn't tell us anything about the health of the people who got off their duff and worked. And also, even for the people who lost coverage, as you know, it's really hard to pin down with any kind of satisfaction the health benefits of receiving Medicaid. Like the Oregon Medicaid experiment is the very best that we have, but it's not powered enough to actually get at sort of the kind of death rate questions you might really care about, or blood pressure questions you might really care about. We have lots of good evidence that having Medicaid reduces your financial insecurity. We've got lots of reasons to think that, and data to show that reduces rates of depression. By itself, you might think that that's a health improvement that we could point to. Maybe a different way of answering the question is, what are the courts saying? So when the Supreme Court hears this, its instinct is going to be I don't know, right? This stuff is complicated. These sound like a reasonable idea to me. They're explained adequately enough. So, sure. And I think that's likely to be how the court thinks about the case, if I had to guess. I actually, if I'm not being recorded, which I am, I'll tell you, it's like I would be gobsmacked if the case goes the way that it went. And if that makes you think that judges have become more partisan, I'm not sure you're wrong. Although I'm not sure that argument doesn't apply equally to Judge Boesberg as it does to the U.S. Supreme Court. Other questions about work requirements, and I'll move on to the.
I have a question. So I'm struck at the beginning of your talk that you mentioned that many of the people that would fall into this category that would lose coverage are providing care, either children or elderly, and there are ways to quantify unpaid work, childcare, household production, informal caregiving, which is an increasing part of our economy, but not paid. Have there been any efforts to kind of argue that there could be a way to quantify and incorporate those and substitute those for paid work requirements?
Yeah, so the waivers that have been granted so far don't take that into account, except in the following sense. So I'm going to get the ages wrong, but in Michigan, you are eligible for an exemption if you are caring for a dependent who I believe, I want to say is under the age of 6, it might be 8.
Yeah.
Now, you might think that as a parent, like, I don't know why that line would be drawn at 6 or 8. You can't leave your 9-year-old at home all day either. So that seems a little bit arbitrary. You also might think that taking care of an elderly dependent is an important part of your role, and like you said, that's not competent. And the rules don't care, not as they're written. I think if you were trying to come up with a scheme that genuinely sort of said, what kind of contribution are you making to society? And we want to penalize people who are not contributing to society, right? And if you could find a way to administer that, right? Maybe you'd include something like that. I don't think that's the goal of work requirement.
Well, no, it's obviously not. I'm wondering if anybody has tried to use that to
push
counter
back.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's hard to see how you frame it as a legal argument. As a policy argument, I think it's great. And I'll be honest, right? Like, I have been railing about work requirements in Michigan since they were sort of a glimmer in the eye of Senate Majority Leader Shirky. And they don't care. They are committed. And if you talk around the country to Republican policymakers, they really believe in these. And I don't think it's, like, I think they don't know the data. I don't think they've thought hard about the consequences on the ground. I'm not sure they care that much. They're committed to these policies because they think work is intrinsically good and they think that this is really going to get people. And, for some reason, for all sorts of reasons, the evidence just doesn't seem to penetrate. Okay, so let me talk about the second big lawsuit, which you probably heard about too, which is the new round of litigation over the individual mandate. And if you think we've been here before, boy, oh boy, I feel the same way, but much more so. This is the litigation coming out of the state of Texas involving the frontal challenge to the constitutionality of the entire Affordable Care Act. How did we get here? Okay, I'm going to try to explain the lawsuit to you, but I want to say in advance that by explaining the lawsuit, I think I make it clearer and more credible than it has any reason like sounding. So just keep that in mind, right? Like, this is my heroic effort to try to reconstruct the argument, which I think is bonkers. All right, so if you go to the Affordable Care Act, it has kind of two, you have to keep two things in your mind in order to make sense of this lawsuit. The Affordable Care Act includes the following phrase: an individual shall for each month ensure she is covered, right? That's what you might think of as the mandate, okay? Then there's a penalty. There is hereby imposed on the taxpayer a penalty if she does not get health insurance. Now, you might have thought, being a reasonable human being, these two things were kind of part and parcel of the same thing, right? The instruction and the penalty are bound up in each other, but they are, and in fact, that's how everybody thought about it until very recently. In the Republicans' big tax cut bill in late 2017, they decided that what they would do, in part to get a better score on the tax bill for complicated reasons having to do with the ACA subsidies, and in part because they wanted to get rid of the loathed mandate, they decided that they would eliminate the mandate. They crowed about eliminating the mandate. They said we are getting rid of it. Donald Trump went on Twitter and said the mandate is gone. The hated mandate is gone. But technically what they did is not repeal this part of the law, the instruction to buy insurance, because they were proceeding via reconciliation, which is a special Senate procedure that allows you to avoid the filibuster. And they didn't have enough votes to overcome the filibuster. And when you go through reconciliation, all you can make are changes to basically taxes and outlays. Okay? So you can do taxes, you can do outlays, but you can't do any substantive changes. So they said, you know what? I got an idea. We want to get rid of the mandate. We're going to take the penalty and we're going to reduce it to 0. So now, an individual shall for each month ensure that she is covered. And if you don't ensure that you are covered, nothing happens. Totally reasonable for the Republicans to say that they've now repealed the mandate. But some clever lawyers looked at this and said, didn't repeal the mandate. If you go back to the Supreme Court's decision back in 2012 in NFIB against Sebelius, what the court said in that case is that the individual mandate was constitutional, not because Congress could mandate people to buy insurance. The Supreme Court said you can't do that. Commerce Clause doesn't give you the authority to order people to engage in this kind of activity. You can't do it. But you can impose a tax. You can impose a tax on people who choose not to get health insurance. That's totally fine. The individual mandate was saved, the Affordable Care Act was saved, and we went on our merry way. Well, these clever lawyers said, if the penalty is gone, this doesn't look like a tax anymore. There's no, a $0 tax. Who's ever heard of such a thing? It doesn't raise any revenue. It doesn't look like a tax. It doesn't walk like a tax. So it's not a tax. So all that's left on the books is this mandate, this instruction to buy insurance. And they say, we know that's unconstitutional. Back in 2012, the Supreme Court said you can't mandate anyone to do anything. You don't have the power to do that. And we think this is a coercive command from Congress to buy insurance. In fact, we think it is a more coercive command without the penalty. This is the really weird part. They say when the penalty was in place, you had a choice. Either get insurance or pay a penalty. Once the penalty is eliminated, they've eliminated the choice. Now you've been ordered to buy health insurance. Now, again, no one thinks this. No one thinks that the individual mandate is now some even more coercive command. No one is actually walking around saying, oh my gosh, I can't believe the federal government is making me do this. Right? No one says this, but you can sort of see how they put the argument together. Okay, now, you might say, who cares? So let's say the courts accept this argument, okay? And they say that the individual mandate, this individual shall, is unconstitutional. So what? Without a penalty, it wasn't doing any work anyway. Whether or not there's a command to buy insurance that's left on the books shouldn't matter to anyone. And it certainly shouldn't matter if it goes away, right? Sure, fine, bring your stupid lawsuit, have the courts redline this out. Nobody cares. Except that's where the plaintiffs make the even more outrageous argument, if you can believe it, which is that actually this mandate, which we now say is unconstitutional, is an essential part of the Affordable Care Act. And we know that because if you look back at the findings that Congress adopted back in 2010, when the ACA was passed, Congress said the individual mandate was a crucial part of the law. Because, of course, the mandate, with a penalty attached to it, was designed to induce people to enter onto the healthcare exchanges to avoid the adverse selection problems and the death spirals. Right? So it did serve a purpose back in 2010. But Congress clearly made a different judgment in 2017 when it zeroed out the mandate. But the plaintiffs say Congress also didn't go back and change those findings. So they say, we can't possibly know what Congress in 2017 thought about the mandate. You know what? We can know. We know because Congress didn't change the law. And so the finding that the individual mandate is an essential part of the act, still on the books, that's still what sort of governs here. And therefore, not only is the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate unconstitutional, but the entire thing is unconstitutional. Every single part of it, all 10 titles, the provisions governing generic entry of biosimilars, the provisions governing calorie count labels in restaurants, the provisions governing obligations to make lactation rooms available for women, all of that, whether it has anything to do with health insurance or not, they say, is unconstitutional. The argument was brought by a group of red states, right? These are red state attorneys general offices where every attorney general in every state wants to be governor someday. And in most of these red states, the important election that they really all do, that's part of the job description. Every single red state, well, almost every single red state in the country, the only election, and true for blue states, the only election that matters is the primary election. And for a decade, these anti-ACA arguments had been catnip for Republican primary electorate. So a bunch of red states, Texas leading the charge, filed a lawsuit challenging the Affordable Care Act on this cockamamie theory. They brought it in Fort Worth, knowing that they would pull a hard right judge who has a reputation as a partisan judge who's already struck down different rules adopted under the Affordable Care Act. And he quite obligingly agreed all the way through with the plaintiffs and said not only the mandate was unconstitutional, but that the entire Affordable Care Act had to fall. And that was in December 2018. So remember, December 2017 is when the mandate is redlined out. 2018 is when the district court rules. A year later, the Fifth Circuit, the Court of Appeals for that district court judge, issued an opinion saying, yep, we agree. Not all the way, almost all the way. In December 2019, the court says, yes, there's a live case or controversy. The plaintiffs have standing. There's a live case or controversy. Plaintiffs have Article 3 standing. Third, the individual mandate is unconstitutional because it can no longer be read as a tax. And there is no other constitutional provision that justifies this exercise of congressional power. You might think, by the way, issuing a completely precatory command isn't an exercise of congressional power at all. Like, it's just like a thing they said that doesn't do anything, but there you go. Finally, the one thing they did do differently is that on the severability question, they remanded to the district court to provide additional analysis of the provisions of the ACA as they currently exist. So what did that mean? What the district court said is that the individual mandate is bound up in the whole ACA. I'm not going to go through and figure out like which parts of the ACA might be saved and which parts won't be saved, will be saved. Like, it's just too complicated. The whole thing is it's a very, very complicated law. So instead of trying to pick and choose what lives and dies, which doesn't feel like a job for a judge, I'm just going to strike the whole thing down. Let Congress take care of it, because right now Congress can totally do that. And the Fifth Circuit said, quite reasonably, well, no, most of it was not reasonable. The Fifth Circuit said, that's too blunt an approach. There's a lot of Supreme Court case law that says that one part of a law is unconstitutional. What the courts should try to do is save as much of the rest of the law in which that unconstitutional part is embedded as possible. Right? And the idea is that if you've got a big, complicated statute, like one tiny constitutional defect in the corner, you don't want to go around just like striking down whole, big, vast laws, because that would actually cut into Congress's ability to, Congress's ability to pass laws and make laws for all the rest of us, right? You'd be tossing out laws all the time based on small, technical, constitutional defects. To save as much of the law as humanly possible. You might have thought that this is exactly the kind of law where you'd just be able to sever the offending mandate, right? And say, you know what, fine, we'll leave the rest of the law in place. The Fifth Circuit quite clearly rejected that approach. Court could have said, you know what, you're right, the thing is unconstitutional, but it doesn't really matter to the rest of the law, go on your merry way. It said, no, you know what, we think you're onto something, Judge O'Connor, the hard right judge. We just think you went a little bit too far. Maybe you could pull back a little bit, save the biologic stuff, save the FDA calorie count labels. Maybe just go through it again with a finer tooth comb. That was the language of the case, a finer tooth comb. But they said, we're not going to tell you how fine a tooth comb you should use. That's up to you to do. We have no idea. Now the Fifth Circuit could have said, we're going to make this decision about what parts of the law stand for. That's a pure question of law. Normally it would have done that. And when the case is eventually appealed back to the Fifth Circuit, it's going to have to undertake that inquiry. There's something very weird about this decision to punt it back to the district court. If the Fifth Circuit could have resolved this issue, could have decided it here, why did it send it back down? The best reason, the sort of most compelling reason is that it kind of knew this was a political problem. And this opinion reeks of partisanship. I'm going to show you one example, my favorite. Some opponents of the ACA, this is a footnote from the opinion, assert that the goal was not to lower health insurance costs, but that the entire law was enacted as part of a fraud on the American people, designed to ultimately lead to a federal single-payer healthcare system. That is not a footnote you put in your opinion if you are a nonpartisan judge just trying to call balls and strikes. Like, these people are very far in the tank. And I think they recognize that, look, if we go about striking down the Affordable Care Act on the eve of a presidential election, that could be bad for Republicans. Experience in the 2018 midterm suggested that this lawsuit itself was a real liability for Republicans. So in close Senate races, there was a famous ad of Joe Manchin shooting a copy of the complaint in this case in his West Virginia Senate race, saying, my opponent supports this lawsuit, and I protect people with pre-existing conditions. So the lawsuit has become a liability in Republican races against Democrats, but the Republican Party can't as a whole get rid of it because these attorneys general have a different set of incentives than their party as a whole. So I think there's a recognition that blowing the ACA out right on the eve of the election would potentially cost Trump his reelection and be tough for Republicans in general. So sending it back down to the district court buys them time. The district court is probably going to take another year to actually resolve this remand. It could take even longer. Then it'll take another year to finally have the Fifth Circuit hear this case yet again. We don't know what it will say that second time around. And then it would take another year for the Supreme Court finally to weigh in. And so it looks like if this remand happens, we're looking at another 3 years where, I'll be back here in 2022 talking about how we're all waiting on what the Supreme Court is going to say. Don't laugh. It will happen. In the meantime, a group of blue states that have intervened in the case have asked the Supreme Court to hear the case now, not to wait for this stupid remand. The fix is in. We know what this hard right judge is going to do. He might save a couple of parts here and there, but we kind of know what the outcome is going to be. Why wait? Why put the American public through yet more uncertainty over the Affordable Care Act? Why send shivers down the spines of the healthcare industry? Why make people worry that they might lose their health insurance on account of this lawsuit? The case, whether the Supreme Court is going to act on the case, is uncertain. And the considerations that you'd want to think about if you were, say, a justice on the Supreme Court are quite complicated. One question is, if you're going to hear the case, when will you hear it? Will you hear it this term? Supreme Court terms run from October until June. So if they heard it this term, they could resolve the case, very short time scale, and actually get a decision out prior to the election so that the election would focus on other issues, potentially. Yes, but I suppose if the Supreme Court strikes down the whole ACA, then the election would be about the law. The alternative is for the Supreme Court to grant the case, to agree to hear the case, but schedule oral argument for October during the run-up to the election, but no decision would come out. We would just have sort of this lingering case hanging over the election. So far, the Supreme Court has given kind of mixed signals on whether it wants to rush this case, mostly suggesting it doesn't want to pick winners or losers. It's rejected requests from the blue states to move this case along, the consideration of the cert petitions along much faster, and it's rejected a request from the red states asking the Supreme Court to move much slower. So it's just said, we're going to consider this in the normal course. In all likelihood, that means that if it's granted, it's going to be heard in the fall. Will it be granted? It only takes 4 votes to grant cert. And so the liberal wing of the court could say, you know what, we think we like our odds right now. We want to rule. Why would the liberals like their odds? Well, the Chief Justice has in 2 separate cases, NFIB and King, already ruled against legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act and said, and turn them aside. Those two previous cases, those were serious lawsuits, right? There were serious constitutional questions and serious statutory questions raised about the ACA. Really could have gone either way. Right? This is not a serious lawsuit, right? Just as a matter of like legal aesthetics, this lawsuit offends me, right? Like it is, these are terrible, terrible arguments. Happy to go into more about why that might be. And I'm acculturated in the law in much the same way that these justices all are, right? Like I've read the same cases, I've worked at the same courts, I've known the same people, I've gone to the same law school, so I know how they think about these problems. And at the margin, like the strength of legal arguments matters. So if you're a liberal justice, you might think, Chief Justice has turned back two really stronger, much stronger challenges. The odds of him accepting a challenge this stupid a decade into the life of the Affordable Care Act are really low. On the other hand, 3 years is 3 years, right? So if the liberals say we don't want to hear the case right now, then the Affordable Care Act is going to remain intact while all these proceedings work their way through the courts. And maybe you take 3 years, pocket it, and live to fight another day, and hope that in 3 years the composition of the court hasn't changed so much that the odds look much worse for you. It's a kind of, do you roll the dice now, or do you sort of let it ride? It's a gamble. The other consideration, and this is like totally appropriate in a room full of doctors, the most important news about this case since this decision came down, actually even before this decision came down, is that Justice Ginsburg was diagnosed again with pancreatic cancer. I don't need to tell you guys, like that's not a diagnosis you want. Now, she had been diagnosed before, and she had gone into remission and had been healthy for many years. She appears healthy now. She says she is cancer-free. I have no reason to doubt that. But she is old and certainly like knows more about her health condition than I do. And if she is looking at not being able to sit on the court, I mean, rather she's looking at it, it looks more likely that she's going to have to leave the court. It's a euphemism for die. I mean, like it's really an atrocious way we've set up the system. But if she dies before Trump is reelected, or I'm sorry, before the end of the year, sorry, before the end of the year, she's going to be replaced by a hardliner who might be much more sympathetic to this case. So if the four liberals can't count on Justice Ginsburg being around to render a decision in this case right now, it might be safer for them to deny the case. That'll turn on how sick or healthy she is. I don't know that. They might. So we're all waiting on tenterhooks. It's been the petitions to hear the case have been scheduled for a conference on February 21. We could hear on that date. I think we won't. I think we're going to have to wait a little longer to learn what the court's going to do. But in the meantime, it's, high-stakes gambles.
But all of this is resolved if legislators, next election, there's a change, authority in both houses, people write better laws that are clear, correct? I mean,
there's nothing unclear about this. This is not an example of like some challengers exploiting a lack of clarity in legislation.
no, but the ACA in general, as we said before, or the way that these laws in general deferring a law to Health and Human Services, they don't have to write legislation that way.
Well, so they don't, although that's not the problem here. The problem is not that they punted authority to an agency. And this is something that Congress has done for centuries, right? Because, of course, Congress can't specify everything that it wishes to do. It often delegates. But that's not traditionally considered a problem. In any event, too, these aren't about delegations here that we're worried about, delegations of legislative power to an agency. This is just simply a construction of whether Congress has the power to impose a mandate. Nothing to do with the agency. So, yeah, Congress could come back into the game and fix this, and I think that is exactly right. So I wrote a piece 2 years ago saying, Congress, you can repeal the mandate. They can still go through a one-page law saying we strike out that offending language and that whole lawsuit collapses. Congress could impose a $1 penalty, and then that looks an awful lot like a tax. Or Congress could simply add a severability provision to the law saying, even if the individual mandate is unconstitutional, doesn't mean the rest of the law has to. So Congress could fix this. The trouble is Congress won't fix it. right? I mean, they can't agree between the houses. And even if they could agree, the House Democrats have been reluctant to do anything that gives this lawsuit any kind of credence. That suggests there might be something to worry about. So for whatever reason, political or otherwise, Congress isn't doing the kind of work that you might think it ought to be doing. And so we get this effort in the courts to do what, this is basically an effort to relitigate a lost effort to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. We lost that fight in Congress, couldn't get Congress to do it, so now we're going to try to achieve the same result in the courts. They actually did this. I mean, if Republicans actually win this lawsuit, by the way, which I think is still very unlikely. I mean, you want to hold two thoughts in your head. This lawsuit is silly. It's very unlikely to prevail. It seems like sensible people at the end of the day will decide, like, no one really wants this. But you always want to keep in mind that there's no such thing as risk-free litigation. And, we've already had 3 conservative judges, a lower court judge and 2 members of the panel, say that the ACA is unconstitutional. Maybe that's some reason to fear that it could go south, especially if the composition of the court changes.
2 questions. Was the decision to zero out the penalty part of this greater legal strategy to bring this lawsuit, or do you think they just figured this out afterwards?
No, they just figured it out afterwards. So it was a guy, the story is like, the then Wisconsin Solicitor General is a guy named Misha. He's part of this Federalist Society sort of circles, and lots of these people were installed in different AG's offices all over the country, and they all know each other, just like liberal legal networks kind of all know each other too. And Misha saw this and was like, I think I can make an argument about this. And sort of circulated his ideas to a few people and ultimately found some takers. But no, this was completely, one of the arguments the Fifth Circuit made when you go back and listen to the oral argument, they said, look, how do we know what Congress would want? We can't possibly know. Maybe Congress meant this to be a silver bullet to bring down the entire ACA. They said that, like, in court. And look, I suppose I can't prove to you that nobody had that thought lodged in their head somewhere. But nobody had that thought lodged in their head somewhere. Nobody meant that to be the case. It's not like they spent a year trying to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act, and they didn't have the votes. The notion that they did so through some sort of weird bank-shoddy subterfuge, that's not the way we want to run the system, even if it were true, which is not.
I'm also wondering if you could put on your Reed O'Connor hat and try to come up with the best possible argument why this cannot be severed. Like, it's hard for me to come up with it.
Yeah.
What possible argument?
Yeah, so the argument on severability is, put it this way. So there seems to be 2 instincts that we could all agree on. Okay? So if, let's say, we have a big law, we got one tiny part of it is unconstitutional, right? We don't want the whole rest of the law to fall, right? We want some rule for severability. On the other hand, if there's a part of a law that's sort of an important constituent part of a law, and you pull that part of the law out, you say that's unconstitutional. None of us would want the rest of the law to stand without this essential feature, because the law would end up being kind of a zombie. It wouldn't work like it ought to work. It would just sort of limp along. And it'd be something that nobody voted for, nobody wanted. And so we all have the view that sometimes severability is appropriate, and sometimes it's not. And then the question becomes, how do you draw the line between those parts of a law that are strictly essential to the unconstitutional provision and bound up in it? And how do you draw the line and distinguish those the parts of laws that are essential from those parts that are not essential? And that turns out to be really hard, not so much here. So put this case aside. In many cases, it can be quite challenging because you don't know kind of what feature of the law was crucial to the key vote in the legislature. You don't know kind of how they ended up cutting this deal. And courts feel really uncomfortable drawing these lines. They feel like they're acting like mini legislatures. So what Reed O'Connor said here is, I don't want to act like that kind of legislature. So he took the extreme position, strike the whole thing down. And it has kind of a virtue of being sort of clean, right? Not messy, not difficult. You just sort of clean up or down. Severing just the individual mandate is also clean. Really easy, and the right outcome, by the way, too. But that's also very simple. But once you kind of get into that middle, it's hard, and it's a question of judgment.
It seems like the only thing about the ACA that would be most at risk would be the whole point of injury and adverse selection.
Yeah, so here's, so I think I missed your question, so let me explain why I can go further. So you might think the individual mandate is just about the exchanges, right? Okay, so fine, we'll invalidate the exchanges, but then you think, well, actually the exchanges exist to channel people into the Medicaid program as well. And the exchanges are actually kind of part of a broader program to secure health insurance to people. We've got Medicaid for people on the lower end of the income spectrum, exchanges for people on the higher end. And if you get rid of the exchanges, there'd be a lot more people who might be eligible for Medicaid, which is itself a problem, right? Because that's not how it's supposed to work. So now this Medicaid program is going to have an effect that Congress never anticipated. And it no longer will be a kind of overall program of social insurance for people. It will be kind of this program that covers one group, but not another group in a way that Congress didn't really intend or anticipate. And like getting rid of the exchanges are going to have effects on the broader insurance market and. I mean, does that move you? I don't know. It's a question of judgment. You can kind of argue it. The whole thing is really silly, though, because saying that, I mean, it's really hard to understand how a provision that doesn't do anything is essential to anything, right? It's really tough to wrap your head around that. And so you have to already buy the argument, which is insane, that this is a coercive command and is really going to induce a lot of people to do something. And if you don't buy that, then it's a really hard case to wrap your head around. And I should say that's a really good instinct to bring to this case, which is to say, if it seems nutty to you, that's probably because it's nutty, right? And the law, there's a sense where like we as lawyers get to be like these high priests of like, well, this is the way the law works, and you know, the Commerce Clause and the taxing power. But like at the end of the day, common sense does drive a lot of court decisions. And so if you can't come up with a commonsensical justification for a lawsuit that resonates with people emotionally, the lawsuits tend to lose momentum. So the first individual mandate case, it spoke to people, right? Like, you're telling me I have to buy insurance? Maybe it didn't speak to you, but it did speak to a lot of people. Like that felt like jackbooted thugs coming to your door and telling you to do something. You know, maybe that felt offensive to a lot of people. Again, I don't share that instinct, but I get it. Here, it's really hard to come up with a 2-second soundbite that emotionally resonates with people. This just looks like a partisan attack. And I think that kind of partisan attack is unlikely to, at the end of the day, survive. But we'll see. I will say one thing I will look for, and I keep looking for, is the Republican Party as a whole throwing its weight behind the lawsuit. And so far, you've seen the party, they did throw their weight behind the 2 previous lawsuits, and that seems to matter. It gives cover to judges to do crazy things. I don't see that kind of support for these lawsuits yet, not from the leadership, not from the party as a whole. There are individuals, you know, Ted Cruz has endorsed litigation. But I think the rest of them kind of quietly wish, secretly wish it would just go away. Questions?
Do you think judges are too partisan? And I think it goes both ways. I mean,
Yes. I mean, but I think the country is too partisan. Judges are people too. I think judges are too powerful. I think maybe that's the way I would say it. I think I grew up on it, I'm sure you did too, have this heroic vision of judges standing up for civil rights and standing up for the little guy. And the fact of the matter is they're usually very conservative institutions that are much better at saying no than they are at saying yes. And I think we have become enchanted with the courts in a way that I think is deeply destructive to our ability to chart our collective course. I will say, like, I say that, and I get a lot of Democrats disagreeing with me, and a lot of Republicans disagreeing with me. Mine is a recessive voice in the legal culture today. But I think it's really unfortunate that we've seen, it's really unfortunate that I'm here giving a talk about legal challenges to the ACA a decade in. There's more important work to be done than this.
Thank you for Professor Bagley